are not uncommon after surgery. And in India in particular, I have seen loss of sinus rhythm after sinus venosus repair is pretty common. All these would require addressing as the patient is growing up. A VSD closure is the most gratifying surgery in an infant because an infant who is unable to feed voraciously feeds once a large VSD is closed at 2 months or 3 months of age, our bread and butter surgical practice today. These come with a small risk of complete heart block, which may occur even later in life. And if you're closing with a device, the risk of heart block is even higher. And even device closure of a large ASD, you should be aware of the risk of AV block for sure. But more important than that, the risk of erosion if you have used an oversized device, even after 5 years. So this is an important knowledge that a cardiologist who's seeing an ASD device closure patient at the age of 30 or 35 should be aware of. And even PDA device closure carries with it, especially if you're not careful about the sizing, risk of obstruction to the left pulmonary artery or descending aorta. I've actually had a baby who crashed after having had a PDA device closure elsewhere a few months ago. It had completely occluded the aorta and the baby presented with a cardiomyopathy-like presentation. And when you have a little more complex defects like an AV canal, had a partial AVSD repair in childhood, and there is moderate tricuspid regurgitation and mild mitral regurgitation, not a bad outcome for this entity, but she also has a 2:1 AV block and is well on the road to having a pacemaker. After surgical closure of ASD, if the echo and ECG are normal in the first year or second year, perhaps there is no reason to follow up unless there is a residual disease or pulmonary hypertension. In the case of sinus venous ASD, I've already mentioned the concerns. And in the case of device closure, the follow-up needs to be much longer, especially when large devices have been used. And we have enough adult ASDs that require closure. This is a 60-plus-year-old lady who had an ASD device closure. You can see the device well in place. Quite often they are on dual antiplatelet therapy, and the continuation recommended for 6 months may need to be individualized when you have used a very large device. And often question comes, is it worthwhile to close an ASD in the elderly? There is a lot of data to say that it is, because a successful device closure definitely improves the symptomatic status of the patient, improves the effort tolerance, and remodels the ventricles favorably. This is my own study from my current center, where there was a decrease in the size of the RV and an increase in the size of the LV in 5 patients above the age of 60 who underwent device closure. But everything doesn't go nicely after a surgery or device closure for an ASD. This is the story of a 50-year-old doctor, my friend. She had surgical closure of sinus venosus ASD at 20 years of age. She went through her life normally, became a distinguished surgeon, had 2 uneventful pregnancies in between. But 3 months before I saw her, she had a syncope. And she had recurrent syncope, in fact, and one of the syncopes occurred when she was scrubbing for surgery, and she needed to be cardioverted. So this was a dramatic event. And this was a representative ECG. It's not her ECG, but this was what her ECG was like. As you can see, it's an RVOT tachycardia. It's a ventricular tachycardia with an LBBB and an inferior axis. When she was evaluated, we found a few things. 1, her patch which closed the sinus venosus defect had dehisced. 2, there was an additional pulmonary vein which was draining into the superior vena cava higher up. As a result, she had a QPQS of 1.7:1, and she had an inducible RVOT tachycardia in the EP lab. So we theorized that the progressive dilatation of the RVOT may be a reason for triggering this RVOT tachycardia. So we decided to ablate the tachycardia and on the same day take her for surgery. She did quite well. She did not have an episode of VT after that, continued to require amiodarone a few years later for occasional ectopic beats. This was with a simple lesion. If you want to look at what happens to cyanotic heart diseases and more complex lesions, I'll take two illustrative lesions. Tetralogy of Fallot is the commonest cyanotic congenital heart disease that would undergo surgery. And no doubt, surgical repair of tetralogy was a major landmark in the history of pediatric surgery. Today, if there is a child with tetralogy of Fallot and we are following from the newborn period or from the fetal life, we would plan to do surgery at around 6 months of age. Many Indian centers are following that, including my own center. I would expect the child to have an excellent outcome. And during childhood, however, such children could have a 5% need for reoperation, 5 to 6% requiring catheter intervention. Catheter intervention is usually for a pulmonary stenosis or more often for a branch PA stenosis or for a collateral occlusion, for conditions like that. Repair tetralogy, we would consider today as a distinct disease substrate because that heart is anatomically, physiologically, and electrophysiologically a different heart, which confers on the person who bears that heart a certain risk of death, which is higher than the normal population, and a certain need for pulmonary valve replacement. And obviously, pulmonary valve replacement will be more for people who have had a conduit. Why is it so? Why do we say that this is a different disease? Because repair of tetralogy, incision on the infundibulum free wall, resection of muscle bundles, quite often, quite a bit of it, disruption of the pulmonary valve, either you are doing a valvotomy in the least, you are doing a transalveolar patch quite often, and you may need to place a conduit. And the VST is closed with a patch, these days transatrially, and in that process you can impair tricuspid valve function. This is a very busy slide, don't even try to read it. I just want to convey the message that there are so many things which are wrong with repaired tetralogy of Fallot. But the important ones are pulmonary regurgitation, abnormal movement of the RV outflow tract because it is a patch which is sitting there as illustrated in this textbook image, an aneurysm of the outflow patch, fibrosis of the right ventricular free wall, and invariable conduction delay. And the things that could affect the RV mechanics would be how big is the outflow patch, how much is the RV fibrosis, what exactly is the degree of ventricular dysfunction, how much is the dysynchronous ventricular contraction, and did you repair it at a very older age? These are things which can affect the outcome of repaired tetralogy in the long run. But of all the problems that we speak about, the important thing that will happen, the most important thing is pulmonary regurgitation. And it happens because, I would come to that in a second, the degree of pulmonary regurgitation would be decided by what is the orifice area. Quite often it is a wide patulent orifice with no valve at all. What is the compliance of RV? What's the diastolic pressure difference between MPA and RV? And capacitance of the pulmonary arteries and duration of diastole. In this, if you look at these factors, there is hardly any diastolic gradient between RV and PA in severe PR, and the pulmonary valve orifice is huge. And the PA diastolic pressure depends on the degree of vascular recoil and the transmitted pressure from LA. And RV diastolic pressure depends on RV compliance. When you have done the surgery, you have created the substrate for free PR because there is hardly any valve. But initially, an elevated RV EDP and a stiff RV prevents the PR from becoming severe. As time passes, the RV relaxes, encourages more PR to occur, and the widening pulse pressure distances the PA and the annulus more and worsens the PR, and now you have a vicious cycle. This is why PR is progressive in tetralogy of Fallot over years. And when we follow up an operated tetralogy of Fallot, there are things that we need to look for. In the history, we will look for the effort tolerance of the patient, any syncope, in examination, you will look at growth and development, you will look at the mental status. Clinically, quite often they have an elevated JVP because the RV is still stiff. Cardiomegaly may be there, RV outflow may be pulsatile, aorta may be enlarged, and ECG could be sinus rhythm, but there is a possibility that arrhythmias could have set in. RBBB is near invariable, but the duration of QRS is variable and has an important significance. This is one of my patients, now 46 years old. You can see the RBBB with the left axis deviation, and the QRS duration is 170 milliseconds. We will be referring to this patient and his problems as we go along. In the chest X-ray, you are looking for the heart size, infundibular enlargement, any RA enlargement in severe TR, any ascending aortic enlargement, and lung vascularity. A differential vascularity could be from collaterals or, as the patient is growing older, from a pulmonary artery stenosis on one side. With all these in mind, when we do the echo, which of course is our main mode of imaging, we have to look for residuae, sequelae, and complications, and looking for all these. And the echo study of RV would therefore involve a 2D, including color flow and spectral Doppler, both geometrical and non-geometrical parameters being assessed. Among the Doppler parameters to assess the severity of PR, one of the main challenges of evaluating tetralogy is to quantitate PR and to see how it is influencing RV function. There are different Doppler indices of pulmonary regurgitation. Two of them are particularly useful. The pressure half time is a simple thing to take, and a value less than 100 milliseconds denotes severe PR. And a jet annulus ratio, in a short axis view, what is the width of the jet and relate it to the diameter of the annulus. If it's more than a third, that's a sign of severe severe pulmonary regurgitation. This shows the values, and what we consider as significant is compared with the gold standard, that is PR as assessed by cardiac MRI. This is demonstrating that an outflow Doppler showing a pulmonary regurgitation with a pressure half time of 109 milliseconds. You have also some geometric parameters. One of the problems in evaluating RV, as all cardiologists would know, we don't have a standard model to calculate RV volume. Now, some of the latest version of the Philips Echo machine has come with a formula and a way of calculating RV volume that's accessible to only a very few of us. Therefore, we will have to rely on other things. And a fractional shortening of the RVOT, like it is measured here, or an RV fractional area change, the RV area in systole and diastole from a four-chamber view focusing on the RV. These are things that have a relation with cardiac MRI. So if the RV fractional area change is less than 30%, or the RVOT fractional shortening is less than 25%, your cardiac MRI is likely to show an ejection fraction less than 35%, which is one of the predictors of the need for a pulmonary valve. 3D echo, it is just evolving. It is still a technology in evolution. I'll not spend time on that. And our usual non-geometric parameter like TAPSE in pediatric population has not been validated. In the adult, TAPSE has some relevance in showing RV dysfunction. Now I'll come to this case history of the 46-year-old electrician whose ECG I showed you. His case history is quite illustrative. It was at the age of 10 that he had his repair of tetralogy fellow. Unfortunately, he had both a residual VSD and a residual RVOT obstruction, so he underwent a redo surgery at the age of 12. After that, he did fairly well till 2010, when he came with progressive effort dyspnea and fatigue and 2 episodes of syncope. I'll show his ECG. He was recommended an AICD in a center. He came to me for another opinion. His ECG I've already shown you. This is actually the ECG from the EP lab. It shows the same ECG as I had shown earlier. It's an RBBB, left axis deviation, and a wide QRS. But importantly, he had an inducible atrial flutter. his syncope was related to atrial flutter. It could be easily mistaken for ventricular tachycardia because he has a baseline QRS duration of 170 milliseconds. So what we did was to do EP evaluation and RF ablation of atrial flutter, and then we gave him a surgical pulmonary valve. He went through a horrendous post-op period, but eventually became all right. 5 years later, he had another child. Later, he presented with recurrence of atrial flutter and required one more RF ablation. And 10 years later, today, or a couple of months ago, this was his ECG. But he in spite of complaining class 2 dyspnea, he could complete 8 minutes of modified Bruce protocol on TMT. He is on amiodarone 100 milligram OD. And I want you to see this echo. In the parasternal long axis view, much of the anterior wall are 2 patches which had been used to close his original VSD and the redo surgery VSD. And his LV end diastolic diameter has become 7 centimeters. His mild AR, that's not responsible for his LV end diastolic diameter, and his ejection fraction is like 47%. This is the LV measurements. And his aortic root is also dilated. I'll make a reference to what happens to aortic root in children with tetralogy of Fallot. You know that the aorta in children with tetralogy of Fallot is actually dilated. In fact, today we know that even in the fetus it is dilated. And this may be related to an intrinsic histology of the aortic root, which is abnormal, or may be triggered by the increased volume load that is happening in the aorta right from the fetal life. And what would be the problem with a dilated aortic root? It can, of course, cause aortic regurgitation and a need for aortic valve replacement. Aortic dissection has been reported, even though rare. And it is recommended that an ascending aortic diameter more than 7 centimeters is an indication for replacement. You have kept the threshold higher because you always have a dilated aorta. With this, I should move on to another practical problem, that is cardiac MRI, and when would you do it in a patient with repaired tetralogy? We would like to do it often, but very few patients will be able to afford it, and access to pediatric or congenital cardiac MRI, there are very few centers in the country. We need to look for things like pulmonary regurgitation fraction volume, the RV ejection fraction, RV end diastolic volume, and there are recommendations for pulmonary valve replacement based on this. I will not go into the intimal recommendations. These Talgiva recommendation from Harvard are very, very commonly employed, and they are popular. This is such a patient. This is a patient which I had seen when I was in Muscat, a 15-year-old patient who already had severe PR and symptomatic RV dilatation. Quite often in tetralogy, the RV outflow and the pulmonary artery is so big that the traditional Medtronic Melody valve is too small for it. Medtronic Melody can't be put in an outflow bigger than 22 millimeter. It was a 26 millimeter, so he had an Edwards Sapien valve, which was implanted there after a stent. Even simple problems like contraception and pregnancy after tetralogy repair are issues. In general, they can choose whatever contraceptive they want, and most women would tolerate pregnancy unless there is a major residual problem. So before conception, it is much better if they have had a proper cardiology evaluation and counseling. And this would also include today a counseling that there should be a fetal echo, and we should also advise them about the risk for recurrence. And it is not only the mother. Mind you, if the father has had a tetralogy repair, there is still a risk of recurrence in his offspring. We had a case recently where the father actually had tetralogy repair, a 22q11 deletion, and the baby has no 22q11 deletion on fish, but has a right aortic arch as an isolated anomaly. Such problems will occur. Endocarditis in any repaired tetralogy can occur, but it's particularly higher after a pulmonary valve replacement. In the children and adolescents, we also worry about neurodevelopmental outcome. 22q11 deletion patients, when they grow up, have a risk of dyslexia and bipolar disorders. Moving away from tetralogy and coming to the common problem of percutaneous pulmonary valve implantation, it is used for a more wider variety of indications as the patient is reaching the adult age. Broadly, we are speaking of stenotic, regurgitant, or mixed lesions after RVOT surgery. Typically, we mean, say, repaired tetralogy, where you could put a stent and put a pulmonary valve, or a repaired truncus, where there is a conduit, or a tetralogy pulmonary atresia, where there is a conduit, you could put a percutaneous pulmonary valve. This is such a case. This boy I have seen from infancy. At 15 years, he had facial dysmorphism and he was 22q11 positive for, he was FISH positive for 22q11 deletion. He had had a truncus repair at 2 months of age. I had stented his LPA at when he was a few years old. He had progressive homograph stenosis. Eventually, instead of redoing the surgery, he had a percutaneous pulmonary valve abroad. Dr. Neil Wilson did it in Denver. This is his cardiac MRI, before surgery. You can see the RVOT narrowing, which is what I am trying to show. This is the RV, and look at the narrow RVOT with a dilated RV. And this is after a Melody valve implantation. It's literally a screenshot. You can see that the injection into the pulmonary artery is not associated with any regurgitation back into the RV because there is a competent pulmonary valve there. Moving away from tetralogy, the other common condition which will get operated and will cause complex problems to the cardiologist who is seeing it is transposition. Today, transposition results are very good. Of course, as you know, arterial switch is the greatest pediatric cardiac surgical innovation ever, transforming a dying child into a child with an excellent chance for long-term survival and normal life. One of my arterial switch patients is today a doctor. The Melbourne data, which is one of the widely quoted data, showed an operative mortality of 2.8%, but that's a pooled figure. Today, most centers in India would say that if it is a simple, straightforward TGA intact septum in a 1-week-old baby, the mortality is close to 0. There are more challenging groups like an abnormal coronary artery, Taussig-Bing anomaly, associated arch anomaly. In these instances, of course, there are problems and a higher mortality. However, when you follow patients after arterial switch, there are certain specific issues that we are looking for. I'll come to a follow-up protocol shortly, but the reoperations that generally occur after the first year, and the commonest indication for a reoperation is a supravalvular pulmonary stenosis. This occurs due to a few reasons. Mind you, the pulmonary root is what used to be the aortic root in the neonate, and the coronary arteries have been plucked away from there, and that pulmonary root has been repaired. This is the first substrate for restenosis. And the suture line is the other one. And the third one is the pulmonary artery branches themselves, which have undergone what's called the Lecomte procedure to bring them anterior to the aorta. These are not at all uncommon, and maybe about 10% or 5 to 10% of all arterial switches, as you follow up them into childhood and adulthood, would require surgery and intervention for supravalvular PS. The different data from two major series, Melbourne and Mayo Clinic, both showed similar figures for this. And the other surgeries that are required would be aortic valve replacement, aortic root replacement, even CABG in a few. The numbers are small, but they do occur, and we need to be looking for them. Therefore, in a follow-up protocol, in the first year, we see them frequently. We do the echo. As they grow older, we add an exercise ECG and a Holter to their evaluation. At some point, preferably in childhood itself, we need a coronary imaging, usually done with a CT angio. And we must be looking for common complications like RVOT obstruction, pulmonary artery stenosis, neo-aortic root dilatation, aortic regurgitation, coronary obstruction, evidence of ischemia, LV dysfunction. And as the patient grows older, cardiac MRI is an extremely useful tool for follow-up. This boy, again, I've seen from the newborn period onwards, he's in the university now. The problem refers to what he had when he was 16 years. I'd seen him on day 1 in Abu Dhabi, did a balloon septostomy. He also had an arterial switch, but he presented with supravalvular PS at the age of 2. He had a redo surgery. He had a repeat redo surgery in Chennai 4 years later. I balloon dilated his MPA quite a few times, but he still had progressive restenosis, and this is what his RVOT looked like at the age of 14. Now, what surgery do we do here? We offered him percutaneous pulmonary valve, which he had in UK. Actually, Dr. Shakil Qureshi did this. This is the percutaneous pulmonary valve in position. Life after pulmonary valve replacement is no fun. 4.4 per 100 patient years require re-intervention. This data is from Phil Moore of UCSF. And 75% will develop restenosis at some point. 15% develop endocarditis. That's a pretty stiff figure, particularly common with Medtronic Melody. And some will develop pulmonary regurgitation. Having spoken of the more complex lesions so far, let me also come to what happens on the left side. Aortic stenosis, a relatively simpler lesion, isn't it? Look at the story of this boy. On day 15, I saw him in Abu Dhabi. He had a surgical aortic valvotomy in 1998. We did not have Tay-Sachs balloons available to us then. He had a surgical aortic valvotomy and had an excellent valvotomy, no aortic regurgitation, but he had mitral regurgitation preoperatively. We thought that would improve once the LV pressure is relieved. That didn't happen. It actually progressively worsened, so much so, at the age of 4, he required an emergency mitral valve repair in one of the well-known centers in Europe. However, he was unfortunate that the repair failed on the 14th day, and he required an emergency valve replacement. I saw him with that valve for the next 12 years. At the age of 14, his valve had become relatively stenotic, and he required a double valve replacement with a root enlargement. We would call it a Kono then. He was again unfortunate that he had a dehiscence of that valve with a defect too large for a percutaneous closure of the paravalvular leak, and therefore he had a redo surgery. At least his surgical career seemed to have ended there, but then he had recurrent atrial flutter at the age of 17. So he had RF ablation for atrial flutter. He was doing very well. He joined a university in England and he was exercising regularly, or even though moderately. One day while walking on the treadmill, he had a sudden death. This boy was very close to me. So these things happen. And the other LVOT obstruction, which we always see commonly, is coarctation. This is a 2-day-old baby, typical problem where there is an entire arch which is hypoplastic, and he had coarctation. So this patient actually underwent the arch repair from the front under antegrade cerebral perfusion and did well. But that is not enough. What happens to them down the line, you should know. If you see a coarctation in an older child or adult, transcatheter management is preferred over surgery. It would be balloon dilatation in smaller children, with primary stenting being resorted to in older children and adults. This is what I would call an unnatural history of coarctation in a young girl. Again, I have seen her from neonatal period. She had VSD and coarctation of aorta. We repaired VSD and coarctation at the age of 2 months. She developed recoarctation and was balloon dilated quite a few times, but she had persistent recoarctation and arch hypoplasia. At the age of 6 years, she suddenly had a presentation with stroke, and at that time the echo showed an ejection fraction like 10 to 15%. We thought she had developed a viral myocarditis, and she recovered from that, but had an ejection fraction like 40-45% for a long time. I saw her 2 years ago in my current institution, and this was her cardiac MRI then. This shows the small arch and a very long isthmus. We decided to treat it surgically by giving her a Gore-Tex tube connecting the proximal arch to the descending aorta. She did very well after that. we don't always diagnose our coarctation in adults on time. This was a 43-year-old woman who had had an aortic valve replacement with a perimount valve, but so with a Carpentier-Edwards valve, but she had a coarctation which was missed. She presented 10 years later with uncontrolled hypertension, and this was her CT angio. This is the type of situation where we will go for a primary stenting. She had a primary covered stent as it was a tortuous coarctation, and she had an excellent result, and her blood pressure therapy came down to beta blockers. When you follow up all these patients, you need to be looking for local vascular problems, including restenosis and aneurysm, ascending aortic dilatation with or without bicuspid aortic valve, essential hypertension, dissection maybe, particularly in pregnancy, premature coronary artery disease, essential hypertension. Half of all coarctations are hypertensive by the age of 40 according to data. Aortic valve disease, bicuspid aortic valve with AS or AR, subaortic stenosis, mitral valve disease, many of them have a parachute mitral valve, or extra cardiac problems like a berry aneurysm or a polycystic kidney. So the hands of the adult cardiologist who would see them at the age of 40 or 45 are full. I would also make a reference to a more complex problem, namely single ventricle. Because today it has become common to do a BT shunt or PA band for a single ventricle in the newborn period, offer them a Glenn connecting the superior vena cava to the pulmonary artery, and do a Fontan completion when they are, say, 5 years plus or so. And this is such a child who has a very large inlet VSD with a hypoplastic LV, which is the basis for calling it a single ventricle. A similar patient, this is the story of a 22-year-old university student who came to us. He was diagnosed to have a complex problem with heterotaxy and single ventricle and TAPVC at the age of 1 year, which was repaired in Chennai. And he did well after that. But progressively, he developed AV valve regurgitation because he had a common AV valve. And he presented to us with extreme cyanosis with a hemoglobin of 22 grams. And this was his cardiac MRI. Remember, I referred to cardiac MRI being a very important diagnostic tool in adults with complex congenital heart disease. This shows the severe AV valve regurgitation. So he did undergo a high-risk Fontan along with AV valve repair. He had prolonged pleural effusion. He required a couple of attempts at embolization of aortopulmonary collaterals. After all this, plus sildenafil bosentan, his effusion settled and his saturation reached 96%. Now, 1 year later, he had called me this February. He completed 1 year. He has joined college, walks 5 kilometers daily. And this is his post-op CT angio. He has said, this is the LSVC, which is the only superior vena cava in him, and the Fontan, is an intracardiac conduit which is connecting the IVC to the pulmonary artery. This is showing that conduit once again. And that's a very gratifying result in the long run. But today we realized that even though the outcomes are far better, we don't expect a Fontan to die at surgery, but in the long term, there are several issues that happen. Some of them require redo surgery, which is a simpler thing relatively, but the bigger problem is the basic physiologic abnormality which we have conferred on this child. A Fontan physiology with an elevated venous pressure and a reduced cardiac output is a man-made heart failure. And in the long run, it is not tolerated, particularly by the liver. And Fontan-associated liver disease, where everybody gets a cirrhosis by the time they are 20 years plus after surgery, is today recognized. And therefore, a close monitoring of their liver function and liver ultrasonogram on follow-up is today necessary. I would conclude here only to highlight that operated adult congenital heart disease is a new challenge for the adult cardiologist. But familiarizing oneself with the pathophysiology, essential follow-up protocol, and management strategies of individual conditions is essential for appropriate management. And in the years to come, this knowledge will be called for more and more. Thank you. Dr. Aryan, I hope I was audible all through. Ajay?
Lucid and very nice presentation.
Thank you. But you could hear me all through?
Absolutely. It was flawless. I mean, there were just 1 or 2 seconds where it slowed down, but it was absolutely it was flawless. I think there was no problem at all in the transmission. So can I just ask you a question? Yes.
Sure.
Now, when they come of the reproductive age, and they ask you a question that what is the risk of my child getting a disease, or when they plan a pregnancy, so what do you advise them? That a clinical evaluation, genetic analysis, in which patient would you advise a chromosomal evaluation? Which patient would you advise a genetic evaluation? And what about fetal echo? And who are the patients in whom you will advise further evaluation?
It's an excellent question. So I would try to answer all the dimensions of that question. One, we have sort of baseline information for individual conditions as to what is the recurrence risk. For some conditions, it's slightly higher than others. This recurrence risk is normally in the range of 1 to 4%. It's a little higher for LVOT lesions. It is higher if there is an underlying chromosomal or a subchromosomal lesion. So based on this, we can be reassuring also. I generally tell them there is an excellent chance that you have a normal child. But there is a possibility, which is usually less than 5%, that you could have a child with a problem. And we could identify the child with problem if you make it a point that by 16 to 20 weeks of your pregnancy, you report for a fetal echo. And that, in the majority of instances, it will turn out to be normal. But if there is a major problem, you have the option of being informed as to what are the long-term implications of the condition that your baby is harboring, and should I continue with the pregnancy or should I seek other options? As far as genetic evaluation is concerned, the vast majority of operated congenital heart disease does not require a genetic evaluation. But when there is a clear history, the father or the mother has been operated for a conotruncal anomaly. It's a tetralogy, like I referred to in my talk. We recently, a few months ago, we had this instance where the father had been operated for tetralogy. So, and he is 22q11 deletion positive. The mother is all right. We did the fetal echo. We noticed the right aortic arch, but there was no other cardiac lesion. Actually, they had an amniocentesis, and we had the fetal 22q11 tested also, which was negative, but there was a right aortic arch. So otherwise, the heart is normal. So we will confine the genetic analysis to those patients where there is a specific reason, like a 22q11 deletion. Was there some aspect of the question which I didn't answer? Because it had multiple...
No, I think it's very clear.
It was a great talk, sir, and everyone has enjoyed. I can see from the comments that we have got. And there is a question by Dr. Saurabh. When to do a pulmonary valve replacement in post-ICR TOF?
I think I should go back. I could go back to the slide that I showed.
Indications of PPVI.
Yeah. Let me just see. What you are basically speaking of is a degree of RV dilatation at which you will do it. So the question is how to identify and how to define that RV dilatation. And this is the Talgiva paper that now, is this visible to you? Is this slide? Am I actually sharing? I do not know.
Yes, sir.
It's visible to you. So in an asymptomatic TOF, if you have defined the indication by the degree of RV dilatation. So you have empirically kept a volume limit of 150 ml per meter square. The reason why that 150 comes, beyond that, if you allow the RV to dilate, the chance for that RV to come back to normal is much less. You are also defining indications by RV ejection fraction less than 47%, LV ejection fraction less than 55%, a large aneurysm of the RVOT, an abnormal QRS duration more than 140, more than 180 is an indication by itself. When you have arrhythmias attributable to RV volume load, or you need surgery for something else, say the patient has developed severe aortic regurgitation, there is an aortic enlargement requiring replacement. So something else where you are going to operate, in such a case, a borderline indication for pulmonary valve, you would use to actually give a surgical pulmonary valve. Is there any other question?
Is there a situation where the RV is very bad and you can't, you should not replace the valve? That is there a level where the RV function is so poor? Can we define that replacing a valve may not benefit?
What we would say is, even at when it is RV is 180 or 210, I've had surgery done, many of them benefit. But the amount of benefit, like the risk of sudden death from an arrhythmia would remain. I would suppose that unless the patient has frank congestive heart failure, there is no contraindication for replacing the pulmonary valve. We have done it in a 64-year-old woman with a grossly dilated RV, and she did well in the long run, in the short run. So it is not that you shouldn't do it, but your benefit from that will become increasingly less, particularly with regard to freedom from arrhythmia. Any other question that I have missed?
I don't think, sir. I see only Dr. Yashpal Sharma, sir, typing something. And after that, we can...
Sure. Yeah. Dr. Yashpal, good evening.
No,
Dr. Smith, I was just typing that in PGI we had a novel iron therapy in cyanotic heart disease. This raises the saturation from 70 to 95%. And this is going to change all the indications for this one, guidelines and indications for all this prognosis as well as mortality. And this is going to be a major change. So this is basically from PGI origin, this novel IV and oral iron therapy in cyanotic heart disease, irrespective of the hemoglobin, because all these patients were iron deficient. This is a new this thing apart from iron in heart failure, iron in cyanotic heart disease, and this will change the scenario of all Eisenmenger prognosis as well as cyanotic heart disease. That was what I was typing. I think there is no need to type. I was thinking that everybody is mute attending. So this is a new thing which I am telling.
I would only say that iron replacement is sort of mandatory, is a medical treatment for all cyanotic children and adults, because like you pointed out, they are invariably iron deficient. So prescribing iron to a child with tetralogy or an adult with tetralogy or Eisenmenger is standard practice. I'm very happy to note that you have found a novel way of treating it.
It was started about 10 years back, but after this ethical clearance and everything, when we did first this thesis, it was such a new thing that from 70 to 95, 94, so cyanotic blue becoming pink, that is a new thing.
No, the rheology is I can only talk to you about the rheology or the hemodynamics, that less hemoglobinized RBC causes more viscosity. So if you supplement it with normal hemoglobinization of an RBC, unlike crenated or whatever it is, the resistance, the fluid resistance remains much lower with a normal healthy RBC. And that can be a reason, especially in tetralogy, and so the flow into the pulmonary arteries can be improved, and you can actually get a better saturation. Otherwise, I don't find any reason how this can work.
Both the size of RBC becomes better, it becomes
Yes.
more this one, as well as the iron carrying capacity, because this is very new thing.
Yes.
I believe WHO has been challenged. This is a patent of PGI that hemoglobin of normal children should be normal. It should not be 10.
Yeah.
In a normal infant and this one, if you see the value of hemoglobin, that is very high as compared to 15 to 17 in male. So WHO has been challenged. So basically, that is the main thing. That is a patent, because there should be normal hemoglobin in infant as well as neonate. So this is a new thing, because WHO may not be right all the time. Books may not be right all the time. This has been done in DM fellows examination, where this medal was being given and one was being. It is a new thing that whatsoever we have done, we have to retrospectively see whether that was right or wrong.
Yeah, even
That
long
is
ago,
innovation.
anemia was in infants a cause for stroke, and most of it was probably due to high viscosity, high resistance flow with lack of flow into the brain. You see that within the age of 2. So I think iron is always an important component of management of cyanotics.
It was innocently ignored because of false values in the books.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. And there are no other questions. There is one question by Dr. Sumit. What is your experience with Eisenmenger patients? What opinion do we have to make? What options do we have to make their lives better? And what is the outcome of transplant in such patients?
The first part, the outcome of Eisenmenger today is much better than what it was 25 years ago. This is because targeted pulmonary hypertension therapy has become available. And my own experience, as well as literature data, particularly with regard to bosentan, the BREATHE 4-5 trials have shown that the quality of life and survival is longer. European data shows that today an Eisenmenger would survive to 50s, and it is then that they get into trouble. So earlier we spoke of survival to 30s. And I myself have quite a few patients in their 40s and 50s with Eisenmenger now. And again, if I can tell a story, a person came to me at the age of 32 when I was in Chennai. This is the only case of phocomelia that I have seen. This person's mother had actually taken thalidomide. He had a large VSD with a hypoplastic ventricle amounting to single ventricle. The parents came to know whether he can get married. He was Eisenmenger, but he had a saturation of 98%. He had a master's in commerce. He owned a firm, an IT firm in Madras with a branch in New York. And he used to travel regularly. He was on, I put him on sildenafil bosentan and followed him up regularly. He did well for the next 10 years. But when he was flying, once he got atrial flutter. With that, he went into heart failure. We ablated the atrial flutter and he was okay for the next few years also. But towards the latter part of his 40s, he started deteriorating and he eventually had a sudden death at the age of 49. This is the sort of natural history that you would expect an Eisenmenger who is taken care of well today. And the literature would support that. As far as heart-lung transplantation is concerned, I don't have much opinion because the utility of heart-lung transplantation and the indication is when the survival without that is restricted to 1 or 2 years. Most of the Eisenmengers that we see are in their late teens or 20s, where with medical therapy, they have an excellent chance of living the next few decades. But in the rarer patient who is actually failing, I haven't had the occasion to treat such a patient myself. Heart-lung transplant would offer a role, but heart-lung transplant, the success rates in many centers is very low, quite unlike isolated heart.
So there are no other questions. I think this was a very great session, and we meet again after 2 weeks on
Smith,
Saturday.
just I want to this one because this is a COVID era going on. Today in a webinar with US and all, I declared that primary angioplasty is inferior to precision pharmacoinvasive and rescue angioplasty. That is on our data and that is being patented. So basically, as you remember, that from PGI we gave this knowledge to whole of the globe that many this one died because of just innocent mistake. With sepsis, the patients were being taken to the cath lab. So if in India also it is being practiced in some of the hospitals, but not in all. Where this is practiced, the pandemic has come down because with one mortality, 70 to 80% patients who were being taken in the cath lab, they were dying. With that, many of the healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, they died. So basically, if I was feeling guilty conscious, if I would have patented this 10 years back when I did research, 2005, the many this one healthcare workers would have been saved. So now we have patented this one our research of thousands patient angioplasty as you this cardiogenic shock patients, and this will be going to be a new novel which will save million to 2 million patients every year, even when COVID will be over. So that is as you in the first PGI webinar also we said the same thing. So because just I want to add this time because this is the most important for healthcare workers as well as for nation as well as globe. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all the participants and the speaker, sir. And a very good night, sir. Thank you.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you and
Smith.
good night.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Dr. Thakaran, you might